Hi, everyone. I'm Diane Macedo. Thanks for streaming with us. President Biden is meeting with NATO allies in Brussels in a high-stakes show of unity against Russia's month-long invasion of Ukraine. Biden is also meeting with fellow leaders of the G7, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the UK, and will later meet with the European Council. The meetings come after the U.S. formally declared Russia has committed war crimes in Ukraine by indiscriminately attacking and deliberately targeting civilians. Verified video circulating on social media shows the destruction in Mariupol, where Ukrainian forces are now engaged in fierce fighting with the Russians. Ukraine's military also says it destroyed a Russian ship at a port under Russian control. We'll have more on the fighting in a moment, but first let's go to White House correspondent Karen Travers, who's live in Brussels for us. Karen, the White House says President Biden is set to announce new sanctions on Russian elites and that the U.S. will also welcome up to 100,000 Ukrainian refugees. How significant are these moves?
Diane, it's another attempt to try and put economic pressure on Vladimir Putin to force him to change his behavior, to end these attacks on Ukraine. The president today announcing this latest round of U.S. sanctions targeting members of the Duma, that's the lower level of Russia's parliament, as well as more of Russia's elites, more oligarchs, as we've seen in recent weeks. This is part of that effort to try and squeeze Vladimir Putin, put pressure on people around him to see if that sparks a change. You know, we've been asking this question recently at the White House, Diane, of why the administration thinks sanctions around people like that, around Putin's inner circle, might make that difference. And they say any economic pressure right now, anything they can do to try and cripple the Russian economy is something that could make a difference in Russia's behavior.
And Karen, NATO leaders say the alliance is transforming for more dangerous strategic reality. The Secretary General went on to say that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has created a new normal. So what does that new normal look like?
That could mean more troops in Eastern Europe, NATO's eastern flank. We know that the president has been presented with the possibility of adding U.S. troops in Eastern Europe and also talk about a more permanent presence there. The president, we're told by senior officials, is constantly assessing the situation, and he'll make a decision based on how the situation evolves. But Diane, you know, here we are 1 month exactly from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think most military experts you talk to in the weeks leading up to that would not have thought it would last this long. So the administration, the Pentagon, the White House, and European allies are constantly looking at what the situation is looking like right now in the immediate term and what might have to change in the short and medium term going forward.
And as President Biden departed the White House yesterday, he again said there was a real threat of Russia using chemical weapons in Ukraine. How much focus is there on chemical weapons at this summit? And is NATO drawing any kind of red line here?
They won't use that phrase, red line. We heard from the NATO Secretary General earlier today who said that the use of chemical weapons by Russia and Ukraine would totally change the nature of the conflict. The White House will also not use that phrase, red line. But as you say, we heard from the president yesterday who said there's a real threat that Russia does that. He has in recent weeks warned that there would be severe consequences if Russia were to take that action. But Diane, the president's been asked what those consequences would be. He has not said, and senior officials will also not say what the response would be if Russia were to move in that direction.
And Karen, China is Russia's most important strategic partner. Now, the White House National Security Advisor said that so far they haven't seen China providing military aid. That was an area of concern, but they are still watching China very closely. So how are NATO leaders approaching China?
Yeah, putting that same pressure that we've been hearing from the Biden administration, warnings, very strong warnings that China should not and cannot help Russia, either with economic assistance because of those crippling sanctions to try and help their economy out a bit, or with actual direct military assistance. We know that the National Security Advisor warned his Chinese counterpart about this last week in a very long meeting, and the president spoke with China's President Xi last week. But at this point, the administration says they do not see any indication that China has done that. But that doesn't mean they won't in the future. And again, a lot of stern warnings, a lot of tough language from the White House saying China cannot take that step.
All right, Karen Travers, we appreciate it, Karen. Thank you. Meanwhile, negotiations between Ukraine and Russia are ongoing. Let's bring in ABC's Patrick Reevell in Kyiv with more on that. Patrick, what's the latest on these talks?
Hi, Dan. Yeah, I sat down with Ukraine's lead negotiator yesterday, and I think the most interesting thing for me that he said was that he considers these talks to be absolutely real, and that essentially in the last month, the Ukrainian resistance and the very heavy losses that they've managed to inflict on Russia has had a profound effect. That essentially Russia is having to moderate its demands that it's been making, and it's no longer giving the ultimatums that it was making when it first invaded. And that's at the cost, of course, of a huge number of Russian and Ukrainian lives. And he said, though, at the same time, he expects that these talks could go on for months. And that obviously is a very pessimistic outlook. And I think the fear here is that ultimately, while Russia may be moderating its demands, in particular around the question of NATO membership and whether there's perhaps a formulation that can be found that's more acceptable to both sides, at the same time, Russia has not given up for now achieving what it at least can project as a victory. And so what we fear here is that we're moving towards potentially a grinding, long war of attrition while Russia still tries to gain some of the things that it set out to in this war.
And so how is Russia reacting to NATO's pledge now to increase defense spending and transform to meet what they call a more dangerous strategic reality?
You know, I think in many ways what we're seeing now with NATO, ironically, is exactly what Russia said it was trying to prevent when it came into Ukraine. You know, they hoped that by doing this they would push Ukraine further away from NATO. In fact, that the opposite has happened. It's now being united around and is being armed by most Western countries. And at the same time, NATO itself has been hugely reinvigorated. And in particular, the number of NATO troops is now, of course, hugely increased closer to Russia. And that's because of the fear among many Eastern European countries that they now could also face Russian aggression. I think there is, of course, a serious risk here that as NATO countries are continuing to supply weapons to Ukraine, that Russia might try and strike at those supplies. And there's particularly big concern in countries like the Baltic states and Poland that at some point Russia might take that sort of step.
So what are you seeing there in Kyiv, Patrick?
You know, a month ago when we were here, it felt like the Russians could enter within days. I remember just over my shoulder behind me, we could see fighting in the distance. We could hear explosions. But now, right now, the center of Kiev is remarkably calm, really. And that's because the Russians have been held by the Ukrainian forces about 20 miles from here on the edge of the city. And there's intense fighting there, very intense fighting. But the Ukrainians now have gone on a counterattack and have managed to push the Russians back to a certain degree. The Ukrainians even claim that they've managed to encircle the Russians to a certain degree. And I think that is remarkable. What it means is that the Russians, at the very least, are on the back foot. And so, again, right now, there's no sense, and no military experts believe the Russians are in position to encircle Kiev in the near future, and that the only hope they have of doing that is if they can bring significant reinforcements from Russia, which would mean some kind of mobilization in Russia, which would be a very difficult political decision for Vladimir Putin.
All right, and the first U.S. shipments of weapons and military equipment are arriving in Ukraine. What impact could those have, Patrick?
You know, I think those shipments of weapons are having a huge impact. I think it's one of the reasons that we're seeing the Ukrainians able to resist in the way that they are, especially these anti-tank weapons. And they're using them against Russian columns very effectively. You know, NATO assesses that Russia may have lost 7,000 troops in the last month, which is, of course, enormous. And, you know, generally in military understanding, if you have 7,000 dead, then potentially you have 3 times as many wounded. And so that would be an enormous amount of casualties for Russia to have sustained. I think also what we're hearing and what I heard yesterday from this negotiator, this presidential aide, this Ukrainian presidential aide, who was saying to me that more air defense is essential, that if they want to push Russia into eventually having a negotiated settlement, they need more ways of inflicting pain, and the air defense in particular is essential to that.
All right, Patrick Wiebel in Kyiv for us. Patrick, stay safe. Thank you. And as Patrick mentioned, Ukrainian forces are now keeping up the fight against the Russian invasion. U.S. defense officials say the Russian military east of Kyiv has been pushed back to 34 miles outside of the capital. And to the north, Russians are now in defensive positions. Let's bring in ABC News national security and defense analyst Mick Mulroy, along with ABC News contributor and former senior CIA field operative Daryl Blocker for more on this. Mick, we're now a month into this conflict. When you think back to when this invasion started, what's your reaction to where things stand right now?
So, Diane, I think that it's shocking to many to see just how effective the Ukrainians have been in repulsing this invasion, and quite frankly, just how incompetent the Russian forces have been in almost every level of the principles of war. From picking an objective and not going after every objective to a unified command, we don't even know who's in charge, and to their just horrible logistics and communications. But it really has allowed the Ukrainians to turn the tide, and now they're on the offensive. And I think we need to look at what we can provide them in this phase, the offensive phase, for what they can do to enhance their abilities to repel the Russian invasion. And that would include transport, that would include vehicles and aircraft that they can maneuver on the battlefield to really get after the Russians.
Now, Daryl, in Brussels today, President Biden ignored a question on whether the use of chemical weapons by Russia would be a red line. But UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson later responded to that same question, saying Putin has already crossed a red line of barbarism. Do you think there should be a special response for chemical weapons, or is it all bad?
I think chemical weapons are just heinous. If you've seen what they actually do to the body, anyone who does that will know that it is a crime, a war crime. I think establishing red lines is always precarious, because if you don't live up to whatever you said you're going to do, then what's the point of having red lines? I would avoid them if at all possible, whether the United States, NATO, or the UK.
And Mick, the Ukrainian Navy claims it destroyed a ship at the port this morning, which is occupied by Russian forces. Verified video circulating online also does show a ship burning in that port. So assuming this claim is true, how significant is that?
Very significant. A lot of people were wondering why the Russian naval infantry, what we would call our Marine Corps, had not landed to try to take Odessa, the key port city that's left, and that would essentially cut the Ukrainians off from the sea. One of the reasons was because they might have been concerned that the Ukrainians had these types of weapons. So it is significant, and it could make the Russians adjust in their entire plan for the south of Ukraine, and just how they're going to create this buffer, this land bridge between Russia and Crimea, and then Odessa, and how they would actually cut the Ukrainians off from the sea.
And Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky spoke to NATO allies this morning. Now, the first portions of the $800 million in military aid to Ukraine have now been delivered. Daryl, I wonder, one, how much of an impact they will have, and two, what do you think of Zelensky's request to NATO leaders today to give Ukraine planes and tanks? He said, give me 1% of your planes, give me 1% of your tanks.
I still think that under bilateral relationships, the Polish government, the Polish military could send the MiG-29s directly to the Ukrainians. They don't need a NATO angle to it. The request is valid, just in the sense that it's out there, and that now Putin knows that the NATO folks are meeting, discussing red lines, discussing chemical weapons, discussing provisions and material provided to the Ukrainians. So I think it's significant. I think it's excellent. And I think Putin and the Russian Federation are on the ropes.
All right, Mick Mulroy, Daryl Blocker, thank you both.
Thank you.
We'll be right back with some of the day's other top stories right after this break. Stay with us. Welcome back to ABC News Live. A former Boeing pilot accused of fraud after 2 deadly crashes has been found not guilty. Transportation correspondent Gio Benitez has the latest. Hi, Gio.
Good morning, Diane. That pilot was the only person facing criminal charges in the 737 MAX investigation. Now, overnight, he was found not guilty. Now, you'll remember those 2 deadly crashes, the first in Indonesia in 2018, the other in Ethiopia. Just months later, hundreds were killed. The crashes were blamed on a new automated flight control system that almost no pilot knew about. And that's where Mark Faulkner comes in. He was Boeing's chief test pilot, and he had been accused of intentionally misleading the FAA about that new system. Prosecutors said he was trying to enrich Boeing by limiting how much training pilots would need for it, making the new jet more attractive to airlines. Now, the jury found him not guilty on all 4 counts. Diane?
All right, Gio Benitez, thank you. And Prince William and Duchess Kate are on a Caribbean tour, but it's not exactly going as planned. The royals are now being forced to reckon with the UK's colonial past. ABC's Ariel Reshef has the details.
I want to express my profound sorrow. Slavery was abhorrent, and it should never have happened.
Standing before a quieted crowd, Prince William trying to make amends.
While the pain runs deep, Jamaica continues to forge its future with determination, courage, and fortitude.
Speaking at a dinner in Jamaica Wednesday, the Duke echoing his father.
I strongly agree with my father, the Prince of Wales, who said in Barbados last year that the appalling atrocity of slavery forever stains our history.
The remarks after a welcome for the royal couple Wednesday morning, where Jamaica's prime minister had a message.
We are moving on.
All smiles during the meet and greet, but the prime minister not shying away from saying it is Jamaica's destiny to become an independent country.
We intend to fulfill our true ambitions and destiny as an independent, developed, prosperous country.
Prime Minister Holness, like prime ministers before him, came into his position with the promise of transitioning the country into a republic.
The government has already made a decision long before this opportunity presented itself for a visit. I think the country and the government have developed a consensus on the way forward that we must be a republic.
Jamaica set on a course to follow Barbados and remove the Queen as head of state.
What it means is that on her watch, she'll lose another realm, which will be disappointing for her.
Next, the royal couple heads to the Bahamas, where it may not be smooth sailing either. Activists have penned an open letter calling on the royals to apologize for the royal family's role in the slave trade. Diane?
All right, Ariel Reshef, thank you. Coming up, we are counting down to the Oscars with a star who's nominated for the second year in a row. More on that when we come back. Welcome back. Oscar Sunday is right around the corner, and Riz Ahmed is once again hoping for Oscar Gold. He was up for Best Actor last year for his role in The Sound of Metal. Now he's hoping to walk away with Best Live-Action Short Film for The Long Goodbye. He's also the executive producer of the animated documentary Flea, also up for 3 Oscars this year. And somehow Riz Ahmed found the time to come and chat with us. Take a look. Riz, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
It's our pleasure. So let's talk about The Long Goodbye, because the film starts with this immigrant family in Britain preparing for a wedding. Everything seems kind of lovely and very familial, and I think a lot of people can relate. And then all of a sudden, this family is attacked. And I won't say more than that because I don't want to spoil it, but so much happens in under 12 minutes. So how did the story come together, and what was it like trying to tell that whole thing in such a short period of time?
You know, you're right. There's so much that happens in this movie. I was joking with the director, Anil Karia, that more happens in this movie than has happened in most of all my other movies combined. So it's a real roller coaster ride, and I think that's partly why people have been so excited to watch it, to share it, and pass it on. I got to be honest, I wasn't sure if he'd be able to pull it off. You know, like you said, it starts off almost like a family comedy, then it goes into, I won't say too much, but it almost feels like a musical horror. And then it ends up with something quite poetic and quite personal. But really what the story is about is, I guess, a bit of a wake-up call. You know, sometimes it feels like we're living in such a divided society. This felt like just something very personal that me and Anil had to make for ourselves, really. It's almost like therapy to just kind of get some of our fears, our nightmares even, out there on the screen. And of course, what happens when you share your story, even if it's a nightmare, once you share it and it connects with people, it turns into a kind of dream, you know? Telling a story, even if it's a difficult or hard-hitting one, is a kind of hopeful act. It's an act of connection. So it's been amazing to see how this story has connected with so many people from around the world.
Now, in addition to the many hats that you wear that I mentioned in the intro, you're also a rapper, and you mentioned this is like a musical horror in sort of the middle of the film, and it's actually named after your album, The Long Goodbye. So how did the music lay the groundwork for the film? And you talk about personal fears that come into it. What were those personal fears that drove you to write this music and then eventually this movie?
I guess they both grew out of the same headspace. And that headspace, you know, to answer your question, was one of questioning my identity, where my home was and where I belong. And, you know, that's, I think, a question that a lot of people are asking themselves at this time, but it's also a timeless question. You know, people in Ukraine, people in Afghanistan, our main character in the animated documentary we produced called Flee, they're also asking these questions. And so I guess Anil and I, the director, we met each other at a moment when we were just asking these questions, saying, you know, things feel so divided. There's so much rising intolerance right now. Some people seem to think that people like you and me don't belong in Britain. We should go home to where we came from. Or where is home? I thought this was my home. And so these are kind of questions I think a lot of people wrestle with. And that's what that question is what the album grew out of, and it's also what this short film grew out of. And really the answer to that question is something that's delivered at the end of the film in a way that's very personal.
And last year, you made history as the first Muslim ever nominated for Best Actor. You've been very vocal about the need for more Muslim representation in the entertainment industry in general. So can you explain why that's so important, and do you think that that message is getting through?
You know, stories are how we imagine ourselves into other people's lives. It's kind of almost like a magical kind of, like, it's like a body swap technology, you know? That's how I can watch a movie and suddenly feel like I'm Meryl Streep. You know, I'm crying because Meryl Streep is going through something crazy on screen. It's a really profound, spiritual, kind of mysterious thing, you know, telling stories. And when you open up a kind of world where certain stories are pushed to the side, certain experiences are not thought of as important or human, really dangerous things can happen. In fact, the kind of dangerous things that we portray in A Long Goodbye. So I think stories are a place for us to all realize that we're all essentially one, you know, underneath the differences that seem to separate us. We have one set of emotions that we all draw from, you know? So that's why I think it's important to have all different kinds of people on screen represented. Muslims, unfortunately, over the last 20 years have been portrayed in a particularly damaging way, and we've got lots of statistics that show that and show the impact of that. So I'm hopeful that we're going to create some change. And my company, Left Handed Films, is actually working with the Pillars Fund to create a kind of scholarship for the next generation of Muslim filmmakers. Their names have just recently been announced. And, you know, we're hopeful to sow some of these seeds for change.
Well, good luck to you, Riz Ahmed. You're a talented actor and now a talented movie maker as well as musician. Can't say enough about you, and so looking forward to more people seeing this film and that message getting out there. Thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
And you can watch the Oscars on Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern on ABC, and tune in early at 1:30 p.m. Eastern for our red carpet coverage right here on ABC News Live and on Hulu. I'm Diane Macedo. Stay with us as ABC News Live continues with news, context, and analysis.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.